Hey everyone, we're your TAs. I'm Gabby.
And I'm Courtney.
And I'm Noella.
And let's start to discuss protein. Let's get into it.
Protein, the building blocks. Chapter 7 Learning Objectives. 1. Discuss building blocks of proteins, amino acids. 2. Outline functions of protein in the body. 3. Differentiate unique dietary patterns as they pertain to protein. 4. Calculate individual dietary protein needs and discuss protein-rich foods. 5. Design a vegan meal containing a complete protein. Let's jump right into our first learning objective. Define amino acid. Amino acids are small organic molecules that contain nitrogen. Amino acids can link together via peptide bonds. When two or more amino acids are linked together, they're called a peptide, hence the name peptide bond. What do you think the name of two amino acids connected together are called?
I think it would be
Dipeptide?
Yeah, you're right. And so if we think of 3, it would be a tripeptide. And if more than that, it would be a polypeptide, which those all form proteins. Next is learning objective 1B. The central carbon is bonded to 4 items. What are they? First, we have a hydrogen. Then we have an amine group, an NH2. And then we have a carboxyl acid group, a carbon, 2 oxygen, and a hydrogen. And then we have a side chain, which is noted as R in this picture. This is dependent on the type of amino acid. This is the varying factor in it. Learning objective 1C, image of central carbon. This is where I want you to turn to page 129 and draw what we just discussed before. Feel free to pause the video as needed. So now that we can break this down, we have our amine group, hence the name amino acid, so amino. We have our 2 hydrogens and a nitrogen attached to that central carbon, the hydrogen, and then we have the carboxylic acid, hence the name amino acid. That's where the acid portion comes from. And then we have our R group, which we said is variable depending on the amino acid. The next objective is 1D. What does the NIH say about essential amino acids? So it says that amino acids cannot be synthesized by humans, essentially saying it cannot be made by the body. These amino acids must come from our diet, as we do not have the metabolic pathways to obtain them.
All right, thank you, Courtney, for explaining what amino acids are. Now I'm going to take you guys into what the functions of protein are. So let's talk about learning objective 2, outlining the functions of proteins and how they are made. So now let's go over the 8 major functions of protein. This section is not included in your notes, but if you want to go to page 130 and write these functions under the nutrition facts panel, then you're welcome to. So the 8 major functions of protein are 1, cell growth, repair, and maintenance. 2, enzymes and hormones. 3, fluid and electrolyte balance. 4, maintaining acid-base balance. 5, immunity. 6, an energy source. 7, transport and storage of nutrients. And lastly, 8, nerve function, blood clotting, and wound healing. Keep these functions in mind when we continue to talk about protein and protein balance. So what is protein? Protein is found in both plant and animal-based foods, and protein, like Courtney said, is made up of hundreds or thousands of different amino acids. So let's get into more of what amino acids are when it comes to your diet. Like Courtney said before, there are essential and non-essential amino acids. In total, there are 20 different amino acids that can be combined to make every type of protein in the human body. And also, like Courtney said, what makes these amino acids different is the type of R group. If you look at the picture I have on the slides, this contains all the 20 amino acids. And as you can see, some have larger R groups or smaller R groups, but that difference in that functional side chain is what makes each amino acid unique. Amino acids are split up into 2 categories: essential amino acids and non-essential amino acids. Essential amino acids cannot be made by the body, and they must be consumed in the diet. 9 out of the 20 amino acids are essential. Then there are non-essential amino acids. These amino acids can be made by the body, and 11 out of the 20 amino acids are non-essential. So where can we find protein within our diet? Protein can be found in beans, peas, and lentils, otherwise known as legumes, dairy products, eggs, meat, poultry, seafood, soy products, nuts and seeds, and lastly, whole grains. So what does protein do within our body? Protein provides 4 kilocalories of energy per gram of protein, and it is key to important body processes. Protein is a component of every cell in the body, and it is necessary for growth and development. So think of your skin, your hair, and your nails. Every part of your body contains protein, and that's why eating protein is key to keeping up with those functions that we talked about earlier. Now let's look into some health facts about protein. First, most Americans actually consume enough protein to meet their recommended needs. Next, evidence suggests that diets lower in processed meats, refined grains, and added sugars, and higher in vegetables, fruits, whole grains, legumes, and seafood are associated with a reduced risk in heart disease. Lastly, dietary guidelines for Americans recommend a variety of protein sources from both plants and animals. So let's talk about what these different protein sources can look like. A complete protein contains all essential amino acids. So those 9 out of 20 essential amino acids, a complete protein would contain each one of them, all 9. An incomplete protein contains some, but not all essential amino acids. Or it doesn't contain enough of one or more essential amino acids. Next, we have complementary proteins. And these are 2 or more incomplete protein sources that when combined create a complete protein. So to picture this, think of 2 different puzzle pieces. Each piece has some amino acids, but not all essential amino acids. So neither has all 9, but when you put them together, they have all 9. So let's take a closer look at an example of a complementary protein. So from the American Society of Nutrition, I included a table that includes foods and their complementary proteins. I want to point out that a limited amino acid points out which amino acid is missing from the food, but you do not need to know which specific amino acid. So I didn't include it within this presentation, but if you're more curious, you can take a look at the article and see which specific amino acids are being limited in each food group. But beyond that, if we look at the foods column, we have beans, grains, nuts and seeds, vegetables, and corn. And if we look across to the other side, we can see their complements. So let's say we make a meal with grains, rice. And now we want to think of what we can combine with grains to create a complete protein for our meal. Looking at this table, we would combine grains with legumes. One important pattern that I want to point out at this table is that legumes and grains are some of the best complements when it does come to complementary proteins. So moving on, let's look at some action steps and how you can monitor the protein in your diet. Before we start, I would like you guys to cross off these specific facts that are found on page 131 in the section action steps. They're right in the middle next to the gray box where it says the daily value for protein is 50 grams per day. We've decided that this information isn't necessarily accurate for each individual. So moving on into the action steps that you do want to focus on. First, we want to choose a variety of protein sources. Lentils, tofu, nuts and seeds, beans, and dairy products are all good places to start. And even being able to combine these sources as well will be helpful. Next, if you are choosing animal-based meats, select lean meats and/or try baking, broiling, or steaming these meats. Let's move on to learning objective number 3. Differentiate unique dietary patterns as they pertain to protein. So what is a dietary pattern?
Is it the type of food that we eat?
Yeah, it can be. And it also can be the type of food that we don't eat or other lifestyle patterns that follow along with diet. So why might it be important for people like vegetarians, pescatarians, or vegans to be conscious of their protein intake in their specific dietary pattern?
Not get the proteins from meat.
That is true. Some of these dietary patterns don't include meat, and so you'll learn more as we go along. So first, what is a fruitarian? Some fruitarians wish, like Jens, to avoid killing anything, including plants, and refer to ahimsa fruitarianism. For some fruitarians, the motivation comes from a fixation on a utopian past, their hope being to return to a past that predates an agrarian society to whence humans were simply gatherers. Now, what is a vegan? From the vegan society, someone whose diet is plant-based and avoids all animal-based foods, including dairy products, honey, eggs, animal protein, and gelatin.
What is a lacto-ovo-vegetarian? This is someone who eats plant-based, but also has milk, so the lacto portion of that, and then also eats eggs, so ovo, so lacto-ovo-vegetarian. Next is a pescatarian. This is a person who also eats plant-based. They also drink milk, they have eggs, but they sometimes consume fish. What is a flexitarian? First thing I would like to mention, this one is not currently in our book. It's on 132, but please feel free to fill in any information on the blank space. So this is a person who eats mainly plant-based, but also allows for moderate consumption of fish and meats. Another name for them is also called a casual vegetarian.
Now, let's get into who can be categorized as an omnivore. An omnivore is an individual who consume food from both plant and animal origin. They could eat meat, veggies, fruits, everything. Nothing's off limits when it comes to an omnivore. And what would be a carnivore diet? A diet consisting of only meat and organs would be referred to as a carnivore diet. So no fruits, no veggies, nothing. Just meat, just organs. Let's move on to learning objective 4A. What are the essential minimum protein needs of a sedentary individual? Let's start by breaking this down a little further. Who is a sedentary individual? An individual who is lightly or moderately active and is a healthy individual would be considered as a sedentary individual. And the minimum protein required for a sedentary individual to perform regular body functions would be 0.8 gram protein per kg of body weight per day, which would be equivalent of 0.36 gram protein per lb of body weight per day. Okay, let's get into a little more depth and talk about the numbers required for specific target groups. Firstly, we have the RDA, which is the recommended dietary allowance. It is a minimum dietary protein that is required per day for optimal body functioning. And remember, this is not a number that we need to target. This is just the base number that is, or the base amount that is required for our regular body functioning. Next, let's move on to the ideal target. What should we ideally target in terms of protein? Well, 1.2 grams of protein per kg body weight per day would be an ideal number to target. That would amount for about 15 to 20% of our dietary calories per day. And then let's move on to MyFitnessPal, the app that you all have been using to track your dietary intakes. MyFitnessPal usually overcalculates your protein needs. It takes up to 1.4 gram of protein per kilogram of body weight per day, which amounts to about 18 to 20% of your daily caloric intake. And then we have hypertrophy. We'll get into details about hypertrophy in the coming slides. But the protein requirements for hypertrophy are usually double than the RDA suggested requirements. So that makes it about 1.6 gram of proteins per kilogram body weight per day, which amounts to about 22 to 28% of the daily caloric intake. Next, let's move on to recovering individuals. Well, remember Gabby pointed out earlier how one of the major functions for protein was in growth and development. So recovering individuals would require around 1.8 grams of protein per kilogram body weight per day, which amounts to around 25 to 30% of the daily caloric intake. But remember, the max limit of dietary calories through proteins should be 35%, no more. Now that we've talked so much about the minimum protein requirements, let's try calculating some. Well, we all know Tom. This is our friend Tom from Ike. He wants to be more healthful and he comes to you for advice on what his minimum daily protein intake should be. As a friend who has attended this lecture on Fission 120, I'm sure you'll know what to do and how to recommend him. Let's keep in mind that Tom has a body weight of 220 lbs and has a sedentary lifestyle. Now would be a great time for you to pause your videos, grab a piece of paper and a pen and try calculating. Feel free to drop your calculations in the comment box below. Hopefully you all have gotten all your calculations down by now. So let's walk through it together. As I mentioned, Tom is a healthy individual who is moderately active and hence his minimum protein requirement would be 0.8 grams of protein per kg of his body weight or 0.36 grams per lb of his body weight per day. Let's note that 1 kilogram can be translated to 2.2 lbs. So if Tom is 220 lbs, we can convert his body weight to 100 kgs. So 220 lbs divided by 2.2 would be 100 kgs. And now 100 kg body weight into 0.8 gram of protein would give us 80 grams of protein per day. And so we conclude that Tom would require 80 grams of protein per day. So now that we've talked about our protein calculations and our protein intake, let's learn a little more about nitrogen balance or about protein balance. So remember how Courtney explained in the beginning, the structure of a protein usually contains an amine group or a nitrogen, which contains a nitrogen group. So nitrogen balance and protein balance mean the exact same thing. Now let's get into a little more depth about it. What is a positive nitrogen balance? Well, in a positive nitrogen balance, the protein intake is more than the protein loss. So the gain of protein is way more than the loss. Moving on to nitrogen equilibrium. In this, the protein intake is the same as the protein loss. And most of us sedentary individuals would fall under this category. Finally, we have the negative nitrogen balance, where the protein intake is less than the protein losses. So there's a lot more loss as compared to the consumption of protein. Let's talk a little more in details about each of these sections. Firstly, we have the positive nitrogen balance or the positive protein balance. Gabby mentioned earlier that one of the most important functions of proteins was to aid in growth. Hence, most of the athletes, pregnant individuals, and individuals recovering from illness or injury would fall under this category. Just a reminder, positive protein or positive nitrogen balance would, just as a reminder, positive nitrogen or positive protein balance would result in more consumption than excretion of protein. Let's move on to objective 4B. What are the protein needs of an individual who is working out for hypertrophy? And what does that look like to work out for hypertrophy? As we established in the slides earlier, athletes require more protein as compared to sedentary individuals. Hypertrophy is similar to that. Hypertrophy basically equates to increase in muscle mass. So you're essentially adding weight through muscle deposition. This can be done by resistance exercises and through a nutritionally balanced diet. So what would the protein requirements for individuals training for hypertrophy be?
Would you need more protein than the average person?
That would be correct. Let's get into the details. Well, the NIH Journal for International Society for Sports Nutrition would recommend around 1.2 to 2.0 grams of protein per kg body weight per day. Similarly, the NSCA, or the National Strength and Conditioning Association, recommends 1.2 to 1.7 grams of protein per kilogram body weight per day for people training for hypertrophy. There is a detailed article with more sources linked below. Now let's talk about nitrogen equilibrium or protein equilibrium. Under this category, the nitrogen consumption would be the same as the nitrogen excretion, or the protein consumption would be the same as the protein excretion. Most healthy sedentary adults fall in this group, and so do your three favorite TAs, Courtney, Gabby, and me, Noella. So knowing what we know now, do you think MyFitnessPal overcalculates or undercalculates a person's protein needs?
Overcalculate?
Yes, that's correct. MyFitnessPal often overcalculates your protein requirements, and I've talked a bit about this before as well. Let's move on to negative nitrogen balance or a negative protein balance. This is when your protein excretion is way more than your protein consumption. And so you have less protein in your body. This could result from starvation, consumption of very low energy diets, severe illnesses, infections, serious burns, or even injuries. So, what do you think happens if a person is in negative nitrogen balance?
Are they not eating enough protein? Where are they getting their protein from?
Exactly. When there isn't sufficient protein in the diet, the body usually scrapes up protein from the muscles to use it for your regular bodily functions. As Gabby mentioned before, one of the basic requirements of protein is functioning as enzymes. And so, if the diet is protein deficient, the body would start pulling proteins from the muscles to act as protein supplements for basic bodily functioning. This may lead to a whole array of problems and diseases. Two of the most important diseases that we will be discussing today would be marasmus and kwashiorkor. They're both of these diseases stand for protein malnutrition. However, in the case of marasmus, it's due to overall starvation. So there are insufficient amounts of macros, of all the macros and of calories in the diet. The growth stops and the body tissue is wasted. But in the case of kwashiorkor, it's just the protein deficiency. The body receives all the sufficient amounts of nutrients, of macronutrients and calories, but an insufficient amount of protein. This is associated with edema, which is essentially just fluid retention. So lastly, let's recap on what we learned before. Below RDA would keep you in a nitrogen or a protein negative balance. An ideal target, or if you follow MyFitnessPal, it would keep you in a protein equilibrium. Hypertrophy, and in case of recovering individuals, it would keep you in a positive nitrogen balance. And finally, let's move on to our learning objective 4D. Compare the two articles mentioned in the QR code to view the information from both Men's Health, the article on the left, that's titled, "Here's exactly how much protein you need," to the article on the QR code mentioned on the right, entitled, "How much protein should I eat?" So what do you think is the difference between these two sources?
Is MyPlate a .org website, which means it's a government source?
That's correct. Men's Health is just a magazine and is not a reputable source. MyPlate, on the other hand, comes from eatright.org, which is a government website. And so the sources on the website are verified. The research is extensive. If you go through the article on the Men's Health website, it mentions that 0.8 grams of protein per kg body weight is sufficient if you're not into athletics or if you're not trying to build muscle. And it amounts to 8 to 10% of your dietary intake. But that's not true. 0.8 grams protein per kg body weight, like we studied before, is just the minimum requirement. That should not be a target. MyPlate, on the other hand, has broken down the protein requirement by age, sex, and has given the ideal target protein requirements.
So let's go over the last learning objective, designing vegan meals that contain a complete protein. Let's develop some meals. First, let's do some review. What is a complete protein? Plant-based complete proteins include soy products like tofu, tempeh, and edamame, quinoa, and buckwheat. So why would it be important to understand protein quality, like complete and incomplete proteins, when developing vegan meals and diets?
Is it because not all plant-based sources would have all the essential amino acids?
Exactly. Not all plant-based sources of protein are complete proteins. So we work to combine them and create complementary protein meals. So let's get into it. Does anyone have any ideas of breakfast foods that you would want to include in your vegan breakfast?
Definitely cannot be bacon.
Yep, definitely cannot be bacon or eggs for the matter. Let's see what we can add. I've created 2 breakfasts for you guys. I think some people are savory breakfast people and some are sweet, so I included both. First, you can have a pancake breakfast with protein pancakes, breakfast sausage, which is soy sausage, tofu scrambled eggs, and coffee with almond milk. Like we already talked about, the breakfast sausage with soy protein is a complete protein along with the tofu. But when we look at the protein pancakes, we see that it is wheat and pea protein combined. Like we said before, grains and legumes like wheat and peas combine together to create a complementary complete protein. Next, when we look at breakfast burritos, we have a very similar layout with a protein tortilla that has wheat and pea protein in it, so a complementary complete protein. Black beans and avocado, which actually contains 2 grams of protein per half of avocado. Salsa, and again, matcha with almond milk if you are a person who needs caffeine in the morning. Each of these hits the 30-gram goal of protein and also is around 500 calories. So that's a great base point to be at for a meal. Next, let's think of ideas for lunch foods. Does anyone have any suggestions?
Ooh, sticky tofu sounds great.
Sticky tofu is an option, yeah. Let's look at other options as well. So our vegan lunch options are a quinoa power bowl or a loaded peanut butter sandwich. I chose these 2 specifically because the quinoa power bowl can be a little bit more complicated, but have a lot of different things in it if you're someone who likes variety. But if you're also someone that's on the go and wants a meal when you go to campus, a peanut butter sandwich is a perfect thing to put in your backpack. Let's break down the quinoa power bowl. The quinoa power bowl has quinoa, which is a complete protein, edamame, another complete protein, chickpeas, which are a legume, an incomplete protein, baked tofu, another complete protein, and sweet potato. Next, for the loaded peanut butter sandwich, we have protein bread, which similarly to the protein pancakes and protein tortillas includes wheat, chickpea, and soy proteins. So a combination of incomplete proteins that together make protein bread a complete protein. Next, we have peanut butter, bananas, and peanuts. Lastly, what are some ideas of dinner foods that you'd want to include in a vegan dinner? So does anyone have any ideas of dinner foods that we could possibly eat for a vegan meal?
Some pasta sounds great.
Pasta could be very close because it does have wheat protein, but let's look at other things we could combine into pasta to make it a complete protein for our meal. So for a vegan dinner, I've included lentil curry over brown rice and an eggplant parmesan. For the lentil curry, it includes lentils, a legume, which is an incomplete protein but pairs well with a grain like brown rice, which is also included, potato, broccoli, asparagus, which although they're all vegetables, include minimal amounts of protein. And lastly, nutritional yeast. Nutritional yeast, if you know of it, is very popular among vegetarians and vegans because 1, it has a really savory, cheesy flavor. So when you add it to sauces or pasta, it can give this cheese, savory, umami flavor that you might lack from not having animal protein. And it also adds protein in the macros because it's yeast, dried yeast. Next, let's move on to the eggplant parmesan. Like Noella suggested before, having a dinner with pasta sounds really yummy, but pasta is an incomplete protein on its own. So we want to combine it with eggplants, lentils, and a tomato basil sauce to create a complete protein. Most specifically, the lentils, which is a legume, combined with the pasta, which is a grain, will create that complete protein source. If any of these meals stood out to you and you wanted to recreate them, I've included screenshots of where I added them into MyFitnessPal. It doesn't have the exact recipes, but it does have the measurements and the amounts if you do want to throw them together yourself. I hope you like them.
Does anyone have any questions?